So let's revisit or summarize this idea we talked a little bit in class, which is how the currency of a country might be very prominent in global use in commerce, things like that used around the world, but also might be have very low use around the world outside its own borders. So let's talk about that idea just a little bit. Um, Here are a couple of slides to help illustrate my point. Yeah. So the currency of a country might be internally used. It might not be used outside its own borders. It might not even be widely used within the country. There might be other forms of barter or commerce taking place. But at the very low end, you have a currency that has very little or no use outside its own borders. Perhaps it's used a little bit for trade or tourism on the edges of its borders. A slightly more or broader use would be regional use. You have some currencies around the world. They aren't really international currencies, but because of tourism, because of trade, because of other factors with neighboring countries, there's a certain amount of regional use. That currency is used in a couple of adjoining countries. Sometimes the currencies of several countries might be used in a region. And then you have a few currencies which, while not universally used around the world, do have some limited international use that might be limited in terms of geography, more common in this place, that place, or another place, but not others, or it might be more limited in terms of the percentage of the global commerce market. It might be widely used, but a small percentage. You have a few currencies that are in broader international use, and then really one currency that has very high international use. And one of your best resources for this topic is some data shared by the International Monetary Fund. You can find this for yourself on the web. It's also listed in the bibliography, and it's called Currency Composition of Official Foreign Exchange Reserves. And you'll see this phenomenon that I'm talking about here, which is one currency is a big share, a second currency is a smaller share, a few currencies make up even smaller shares, and then this little yellow sliver is actually everybody else combined. So let's go back to the slide that explains that. As used for global reserve currencies, over 100 countries combined add up to about or slightly less than 3% of the global reserve currency market, as it were. The next tier is there are a few countries that have about 2% each of the global reserve currency market. Those are Canada, Australia, and China. Sort of the next tier is the Japanese yen and the British pound sterling. Those have between 5 and 6, not large percentages, but compared to the next tier or compared to the rest, that's pretty sizable. And there are some geographic prominences there. You'll find Japan, the Japanese yen as a global reserve currency, more common in some regions than others. The same for the pound sterling. And then at the next tier, we have the euro. The euro is used across the countries of Europe. It's also used in North Africa, Middle East, some parts of Asia, some parts of South America. So that's a pretty large participant in the global reserve currency market. And then the big one is the US dollar. The US dollar is about 60% of the global reserve currency market. You can find all the data on this broken down by different currencies by quarter and some nice interactive charts here on the IMF website. There's also listed in the bibliography some readings about this phenomenon. So one of them is this paper by the IMF that talks about the changing nature of global reserve currencies in the international monetary system of the past few years. This is an interesting paper by McKinsey It refers to a comment made by a French finance minister some number of years ago about the privilege of being a global reserve currency. And the McKinsey paper talks a little bit about the pros and the cons of that privilege. You might find this paper interesting. This is by a colleague, Ruth Judson, and she explains why there's a demand for US currency at home and abroad, what those dynamics are in good times or calm, and what those dynamics are in more difficult times, crisis. This paper talks about the foreign demand for euro banknotes, and all these documents, by the way, are listed in the bibliography. And so the dynamics for the European system for the euro is slightly different. And then if you're interested in a couple of other countries, this paper talks about the demand for Swiss banknotes, which interestingly enough is listed in the IMF data. If you see, it's a very small percentage. But there's a historical reason and some other reasons why the Swiss banknotes. It's actually, you can barely see it. It's this little sliver right here, 0.17% on their chart. But there's some interesting, or you might find fascinating, topic about the demand for Swiss banknotes, why that occurs. And then a very interesting paper in Foreign Affairs about the Chinese currency and sort of a summary of the historical efforts by China to internationalize its currency to increase its share of the global reserve currency market. Right now, that's a little over 2%. And over the past 5 or 10 years, people have made note of some very large increases in that, but those increases are going from 1% to 2%, which is a 100% relative increase, but as you can see, is still a much smaller piece than, say, the pound sterling or the yen, or well, I guess they're slightly above, nope, still slightly below, slightly above the Canadians, it looks like, and the Australians, but still not as big as the rest of the market. Anyway, I hope you find that interesting, and if you have any questions, we can talk about it in class. This idea of currencies that are rarely used in international commerce, rarely used for a global reserve currency, and currencies that are widely used in trade, commerce, and a reserve currency have lots of implications. Implications about the design of those physical banknotes and the implications for the prospects of those currencies taking on a digital form. And so we'll talk more about that in class. Thanks very much, and I'll see you there.